We now move to the academic fireside chat, the law of the horse, the law of cyberspace, and the law of the unicorn. How to govern disruptive, fast-moving, nascent technologies. If you want to have a conversation, can you please take it outside to the corridor? Thank you.
So this is actually one of the panels I was most excited about. The way we frame, just for the audience, the title of the panel might be a bit confusing or surprising, but actually it comes from a very age-old debate in the legal circles on, and this was, when the internet first emerged, there was a lot of debate in academia and elsewhere about whether we really needed a new body of law for cyberspace. And so you had the debate between two individuals where one argued, a horse is a horse is a horse. You don't need to create a whole new body of law for the horse. You can apply property law, you can apply transit law, you can apply existing laws to this new creature. And so the law of the horse became kind of a reference point for this idea of, can we apply existing laws or do we need to create new laws? And so here we have blockchain as the emergence of a new technology, and these are nascent technologies that have yet to fully evolve to their full potential. So in the meantime, where we have to, in the real world, apply laws today, is this a law of the horse kind of issue? Do we need a new body of law for these technologies, or can we merely apply existing financial regulations, consumer protection, free speech laws to something like this? So with that kind of frames, and this is what we call, do we need a law of the unicorn now? Because this is something we don't even know what will be or if it even exists. So right now, I'd love the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll kind of jump right into this conversation.
Hi, so I'm Primavera de Filippi. I'm a researcher at the CNRS in Paris, as well as faculty associate at the Berkman Center, and we're working together with us. So in fact, my research is mainly about the legal challenges raised by decentralized architectures. And basically since 2 years or something, I just decided to focus completely 100% on blockchain technologies. And this is kind of how this whole discussion of where are we going in the regulatory aspect. So I guess this is actually going to be a panel about the ivory tower of academia, just to counteract with the panel from before. The question is, of course, there is this new technology, which is an emerging technology, which we don't yet understand it properly, but most importantly, we actually don't really know where the technology is going. It's completely emergent. I mean, we are back in '93s. We know that this has an enormous potential, but we cannot foresee yet where it's going. So on the other hand, there is a current regulatory framework which oblige the technology to comply with, just as we discussed before. And then the question becomes, are we finding ourselves in the same situation as back in the 90s when we saw that the internet was emerging, and so Lawrence Lessig, which was arguing that we do need a new body of law because the dynamics and the premise on which the cyberspace is based requires an actual shift in paradigm on the regulatory framework, in the sense that there is this new concept of code is law. So more and more on the internet, it is no longer the law regulating the individuals, but it is the code that it regulates the action of what people can or cannot do. And therefore, there needs to be a change, a shift in the perception of how the law operates on the internet, in the sense that it's not necessarily directly affecting the individuals, but it can now affect how technology operates, which will then affect the way in which the technology can regulate the individuals. So the question with the law of the unicorn, it's essentially whether, if we try to apply the law of the horse, so if we try and apply the current regulatory framework on this new technological breakthrough, then are we not actually incurring the risk of limiting ourselves to regulating a horse, in the sense that by regulating this new technology in the same way as we regulate this other technology, are we not actually preventing this new technology from becoming something new, which could become a unicorn eventually? So do we have to start imagining, like, as academic, like, shall we start thinking on how should an actual regulatory framework be designed in order to enable those new potential that the technology is providing, so that we can actually support the emergence of a new paradigm that is the blockchain one?
Thank you, Primavera. Good morning, I'm Urs Gasser. I'm the Executive Director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. I'm also on the law school faculty at Harvard. So I'm grateful actually for your introduction and Primavera's first intervention, because I think there is value, occasionally at least, to have a bit of a more an academic discussion. Although I think there are lots of connection points between what we're going to say and the previous discussion. And one of the reasons why sometimes it's helpful actually to go back into academia, it's not only that the internet actually was born out of academia largely, that's only a footnote, but also because we, I think as universities or as researchers, have a certain obligation also kind of to look longer term and try to recognize patterns. And especially when it comes to law and policy, I feel vis-a-vis new technology, there is a lot to be learned from the past for the future. And I think that applies here too. So I'm personally very interested in the interaction between law and technology. And I think that complicates the story a little bit, whether do we need, new laws, or can we just apply the old laws to the new technology? I think the interaction is more complex. And just like to throw it out right away, I see like 3 levels of interaction, almost equivalent to 3 layers of the internet. The first layer is at the systems perspective, or at the level of systems. So you have the legal system, and you have a particular technological ecosystem where a particular innovation comes along. Blockchain, in this use case that we're discussing here, but could be something else too, right? And as we've heard, and I think that was a very clear takeaway from the previous panel, law is already there. So none of the innovations we're talking about here happen within a legal or regulatory vacuum. Whether there is specific law that regulates the technology, that's a different question. But think about contract law, think about competition law, think about basic consumer protection law. These laws are already in place. Now, quite often we think, and that's a bit of a problem with the Lessig framework, quite often we perceive law to be something negative, something that is a constraint on behavior. But I believe at this level of ecosystem, it's very important to acknowledge law has an extremely important enabling function. For instance, that you can set up contracts, that you can find funding for the next business you want to set up, and so forth. So law has not only constraining, but also an enabling and leveling function. And I think that we see, again, as a bit of a complication in the story at this basic level of infrastructure. The second layer is then when particular issues emerge, right? So essentially when the new technology interacts with the law, and the legal system has to go through the process as described before, looking in the financial regulation. So are the old rules a good fit or not? Does the legal system need to innovate and create new rules, new norms? That's an exercise actually that, again, we perceive to be cumbersome, and okay, there's this problem of speed and the business wants to move on. But actually to go through that process, if you look again in the long run and not just in very short cycles, if you look over decades, to go through this process quite carefully is not necessarily a bad thing. Because obviously it adds ultimately to legal certainty, and it creates and we as a society try to find a new equilibrium between competing interests, which is a stabilizing function that law has. Sometimes slow, sometimes annoying because it's slow, but in the long run, not a negative thing. And then the third layer of conflicts, or interactions better, that I find personally are the most interesting one, and that Primavera has written about in very thoughtful ways, is conceptual. So are the changes in the new technology that we see that creates these issues? Fair enough, we'll sort that out. But does that new technology create some sort of a more fundamental challenge to how we think about law and conceptualize law? And that's your point about decentralization and distributed systems and automated enforcement, self-enforcement, where suddenly the law itself may have a challenge or an opportunity, depending on the way you look at it. And this came also up in the previous panel about the point about compliance, that ultimately the technology that we first may perceive as a threat from a legal perspective may ultimately lead to better enforcement or better compliance. I use that just again as an example to link the conversation from the previous panel to this kind of interaction model, which I think that's the basic point. I hope illustrates that the relation between law and technology is a bit more complex than just the question, well, shall we apply the old rules or do we need to create new ones?
Right, and at least for practitioners in the field, all the stakeholders in the field are really grappling with, the acceleration of change, the norms, cultural norms, technological norms, the ability to download songs, the ability to do more things online without permission, and the fact of the norm of lawmaking, which is that regulators have a mandate, a goal, which they then need to protect and enforce. And that rate of change, the gap in the governance is accelerating here. So as we kind of interact with these different shifting norms, both social norms, the regulatory norms, and really the process of making law, which is really, I think, positioned on this idea of a zero-sum game between kind of rights and enforcement, in the metes and bounds of what the state is allowed to do, and the rights that are given up in exchange for that protection. What lessons can we learn? The Berkman Center has been, at the forefront of kind of leading the new policy frontier, especially in the light of the internet. What lessons can we learn from the internet? How is this different? How do we negotiate this shifting landscape?
Well, so on this point, like, this is actually something I'm writing about as well, is the concept of, so we have this, within the framework of Lessig and more generally like the Lex informatic idea, that the internet has basically shown, eventually at the end of the debate, it was a bit clear that you cannot regulate the internet in the same way as you regulate the traditional horse and whatnot. So we understand that there has been a paradigm shift in the way in which you regulate the internet. Now the interesting thing is that then if we go back to like the four forces of regulation that we can see, so in the real world, in the physical world, we have mainly the law, which is stipulating the behavior of people, what people should or should not do. But this is the traditional mechanism by which law works, which is an ex post mechanism of enforcement. So there is a rule and people decide whether they're going to follow or not the rules, and then they will be judged and then they might be punished for infringing the law. On the internet, we see that there is a modification on this, in the sense that now the technology has an ex ante enforcement mechanism. So it is now the designer of the technology, the people designing the platforms, that will enforce the way in which people can behave or not behave without leaving a choice. It's an ex ante mechanism, and then people can, of course, try and bypass the technology by technological means, but it becomes like a technological structure. So it is no longer the law that has the strongest impact on the behavior of the people, but it is the technology. And of course, then what happens is that the law needs to operate at a higher level of abstraction, which is we need to regulate the technology. And how do you regulate the technology is by regulating the operators. So on the internet, this becomes, like at the beginning, it seemed the internet would be like this space, like difficult to regulate, like anarchy and whatnot. Eventually, it becomes quite obvious that there is actually a concentration. There is like the large operators on the internet that are clustering power, and those operators are actually quite easy to regulate. And by regulating those operators, you can then regulate the way the technology that is implemented by those operators is designed, and therefore you can regulate the behavior of people. Now the problem is that we also have to look at the opposite way, which is, as Urs was saying, the law is not just about dictating what people can do, but it's also about protecting the rights of the people. And on the internet, we notice that now, instead of the problem being mainly like regulation and how do we prevent illegal activity, there is this new problem now that arrived, which is how do we protect privacy, how do we protect freedom of expression, because now the operators, the technical operators, they actually have the upper hand on regulating the behavior of people. So the law now is assuming a protective role on how can the fundamental rights of people be preserved, right? So with the blockchain, it's interesting because we go back to the same discourse in some extent, where there is, on the one hand, this discussion about the blockchain is providing new decentralization and is providing new emancipation and freedom. And again, the question becomes, how do we regulate this technology, which seems to be not regulable? We have like autonomous agent on the blockchain, etc. On the other hand, this technology can actually perfectly be used by commercial operator, by governmental authorities, etc., to actually implement or replicate the exact system. And in this sense, we have yet another step, because you now have the self-enforceability, the self-execution of the blockchain, which then people need also to be protected against that. So if I enter into a contract, normally I can choose to breach it, or I can also rely on traditional legal safeguard of like coercion, unconscionability, etc. In a smart contract world, I cannot rely on this legal safeguard because the technology is enforcing the contract. And then that's where the law actually needs to jump in and make sure that those new platforms that are being deployed on the blockchain are also preserving the civil liberty of people and are regulating in the same way that people can rely on the same fundamental rights.
I'd love to hear from Urs in response to that. My only comment to that is that I think the dangers here might be even more subtle. That the invisible hand of what's happening in the background really informs social norms. So let's say an operator, and then we've seen this in the privacy sphere, that you build a platform, it operates in a certain way, people develop norms and needs, the need to connect in a certain way around the way the technology operates, and then you suddenly shifted that landscape, which has the different pieces which trigger different movements. So the law then matches the norms of the people, which have been dictated by the platforms, and so the locus of control or the locus of influence, I think can become more subtle, more invisible, more difficult to actually pin down. And with automation and technological advancement, the danger might be that the technology changes society in such a way that doesn't have the usual discourse, which we hope comes to the right balance between the norms.
Yeah, I would like to pick it up right there. I think the lesson learned, the big lesson learned is coming out of these two comments, which is, this Lessig debate, to which we referred to as a starting point for this panel, was more about, okay, is it law or code that actually regulates our behavior, and are we moving from one spectrum to the other in terms of relative importance of the mode of regulation? I think the lesson learned is, all of the above, right? It's code is extremely powerful regulator. But then we've heard from Primavera's description, governments also got that and beefed up their tactics and strategies to regulate the code through law. And then all that, as you pointed out, interacts with social norms. And so the finding number one is you have to deal with all these different types of norms and different types of regulatory forces, which increases the complexity of our environment and puts pressure actually on the question, how do we sync up the different sources of norms and the different developments, as you pointed out. I think that's one of the key challenges. That leads to a second finding, and to me that is that we live in a world of blended governance. So rather than to talk about law and regulation, I very much suggest we think in terms of governance frameworks, which also I think indicates immediately that the toolbox that we have available today is much broader, and we shouldn't simplistically just immediately, when we think about governance, look at command and control laws. There are many more ways we can think about governance structures. Could go much more in detail, obviously, but I think you get the basic point. And the third finding is, okay, if we live in a blended governance environment where all these norms play a role, second, if we have more tools available in our toolbox that we can deploy, good news so far, then the problem, third, is how do we work towards solutions? Because you have to coordinate among many more actors. You have the synchronization problem. You have to do cost-benefit analysis for the different types of tools you can deploy to address a specific problem. And all that requires a lot of conversations, a lot of negotiations. And of course, all that happens in a particular political economy, which makes it even harder. And to me, that leads to an institutional design need, and that is we have to become better in process engineering. So there's a big debate about multi-stakeholder processes and multi-stakeholder models in the world of internet governance, and I truly believe that's the only way forward in many areas that we're discussing today, but we don't have a really good understanding how these processes work across different contexts, and there again also more research is needed, looking at successful case studies beyond ICANN, whether we count it as a success or not, but there much more work needs to be done.
I mean, I completely agree with this, and in fact, this is the work we're trying to do with COALA to create a multi-stakeholder global dialogue, because this is actually the only way we can figure out where we're going or where do we want to go. I will add also that one thing that is really important if we want to actually learn from the past or from the lesson that we got from the internet is that a dialogue is necessary, but we also need to educate the people that we are talking with, because we actually need to look forward, and most importantly, we need to understand how this technology, not just how can we regulate or how can we design this governance framework for this new technology, but it's also about how this technology can actually be used in order to enhance the governance process. And I will just as a suggestion or as an example, for instance, so in the internet we have the ICANN, which is actually kind of like a centralized model for governing the internet, because that's what we know, that's the way we are used to operate. And I will, as a suggestion, I will say, well, maybe we should actually look at how this new technology could provide alternative model that could resolve this governance problem in different ways, perhaps less centralized. For instance, well, the blockchain has shown that it is indeed possible to govern domain name system in a decentralized manner with a name coin, for instance. And so my suggestion is, like, if we actually manage to educate all the stakeholders that actually are interested and will be affected by this technology, we can perhaps find out how the technology itself can actually be used as part of the process and as part of the solution for the governance of blockchain technology themselves.
And before opening up to questions, I'll just say that you're seeing, hopefully, this multi-stakeholder process in process right now. You know, COALA, we're lucky enough to have Berkman, you know, among other universities as partners. and to invite folks like you to participate in these kinds of conversations, and the builders of the first internet to support us as well in the effort. So this is an evolution in process here, and now I'd like to open it up to any questions.
First one over here.
Hi, I'm an economics professor who teaches law and economics. And in law and economics, we usually distinguish approaches to law based on how much knowledge they require, context-dependent knowledge by judges or regulators of particular circumstances. So say strict liability is relatively robust, negligence requires that you know more. You might prefer very simple, strong property that's clear when deals are easy, or you might, when deals are hard, you might prefer more context-dependent rules about how property could be used. So instead of asking the question like, does this new regime require new law, shouldn't the more general question be, if we're seeing higher rates of change in general, shouldn't we just move back to more robust, simpler kinds of law that require the legal system to know less about the context?
Is that a question or a statement?
Yes, that was a question. Should we just make it simple?
Yeah, that's, I think, a fascinating suggestion, right? Simple rules for a complex world. We know we usually run in problems with that approach, but I have great sympathy, and it's an intriguing exercise to go through. My suggestion would be that perhaps we have to find rules at the degree of complexity that adequately deal with the topic as you suggest, but that's then a case-by-case analysis, and that's what we're doing, I think, and that's why I also believe the regulatory panel was so helpful, where we have a hugely complex environment to begin with, where now a new technology comes in, and therefore whatever the answer is, what we do with this new technology somehow is embedded in that degree of complexity that we already have, and the answer will be more complexity because you have to absorb the new technology in that environment. So I'm not sure whether, I agree with what you're saying aspirationally, but practically I believe we can only do, as we go from use case to use case, to make these determinations, how complex or simple the rules ought to be.
And to jump on this, I think it's perhaps not about like simpler rules, but perhaps more flexible rules, mainly because we should not regulate a technology that, like, to go back to the concept of the law of Unicode, we should not regulate a technology today that we don't know where it's going with the rule of today. So we should design rules that are supporting, enabling technology in a flexible way so that we can let it evolve to eventually become perhaps the Unicode. But I would also like to add, so while we were discussing this panel with Amor Sexton, which is also usually in those conferences, but he couldn't make it today, which is an Australian lawyer, she was suggesting actually that perhaps the law of the unicorn is not the right title as opposed to the law of the platypus. She's Australian, so perhaps that's the reason. But it makes a lot of sense in the sense that the blockchain is a little bit of a platypus in the sense that it is something that looks like many different animals. And if you don't pay attention, you might want to regulate it like a property, like a security, like a commodity, like money, etc. But in fact, it is none of them. It just has properties of every single one of those animals. But it is something different as such. And the danger is that if you regulate a platypus as if it's a duck, or as if it's like, I don't know even what a platypus looks like, but so the blockchain should be seen as this new entity, as this new creature, and should not be regulated just because it has properties of money, just like money, and just because it might be sometimes looked as a security, then it's regulated completely as a security. So there is the danger if we simplify too much, then we might actually lose the sophistication of this technology and just apply it by analogy as if it was something that we know, instead of looking further and actually, it is complex. Like, how do you regulate something as sophisticated as the blockchain, which has so many different facets? You cannot just apply one blanket rule on top of that.
So just a very quick addendum to that. So maybe a reformulation of the question could be, how can regulators ensure to do no harm on the conditions of uncertainty? And maybe the answer is you go for rules or legal norms that keep the number of options you have in the future as open as possible.
Yeah, and just one last comment before moving on to the next question. I was having a conversation with Fabro actually the other day about the right to privacy and the complexity of terms and conditions. I think it would take everybody 1 month, 24 hours a day to read through all the terms and conditions that govern your data today. And so this idea of informed, so this idea that we have informed consent, we're consenting to all of these things that our data is used for, is really a fallacy. And really, and actually Fabro brought up a very, I think a very good point, which is, well, why don't we just make it, illegal for you to use your data in ways that you just can't use your data in certain ways. For example, to aggregate information about yourself in certain ways. And I think, to your point, maybe, as we look at the complexity of the technology and the complexity of the law, we return to things like do no harm. We return to things like right and wrong on some fundamental level, and that maybe we can simplify some things. Next question.
Yeah, just briefly to Primavera, and maybe let's also relate what you discussed just now, that because when you talked about the protection of the consumer and having to be protected from the self-enforcement, doesn't that just result then in, would you agree that it results in just having to wait more to what it actually develops or how the technology will be used? Because I would argue that right now it's kind of self-enforcing, but there's, for example, not really direct debit. Everything is reactive to reacting to some action by the consumer. So in that sense, you have consent when the user sends money to a smart contract or whatever. And there's not really self-enforcement as such. So would you agree that we may just have to wait longer to know if to regulate or not?
I mean, obviously, we need to see if eventually the technology can develop perhaps solution, maybe technological solution. I think the important distinction, so for me, there is two, to go back to the topic of the panel, which is whether we are looking towards a new, or whether there is actually a need for a new shift in perception of how we are looking on how regulation should operate with blockchain technologies. I think there is two important distinctions, which actually I think weight towards the fact that yes, there needs to be a shift in perception. The first one is that, in fact, so when we interact on the blockchain, we're actually interacting on rules which are defined by the technology. So when I enter into a smart contract, the contractual framework that I'm entering into is defined by the technology. When I'm transferring smart property or a title to a digital assets, the property is defined by the code, which means that whatever legal rules exist on property law or on contract law can difficultly be applied on the blockchain unless the blockchain actually provide a mechanism to, for instance, seize these to seize the property that has been transferred. If I transfer Bitcoin, I cannot rely on the technology to actually seize those Bitcoins. When I enter into a smart contract, unless the smart contract actually provide for mechanism to allow for the contractual, the traditional provision of contract law to actually be enforced within the smart contract framework, then I don't have any recourse as an individual. So yes, of course, the technology can design. We can create more sophisticated contracts which replicate the same legal safeguard as the traditional legal framework. We need to see whether this is actually what will happen. And then the second thing that might require a shift in the way in which we perceive the regulatory framework is the fact that when we actually enter into the context of those algorithmical agents or smart contracts which are deployed on the blockchain and which actually provide those software which are not necessarily operated by anyone, then we have this issue that traditionally the regulatory framework is based on the concept of regulating an individual or a legal person. So when you actually have those algorithmical entities which are autonomous on the blockchain, then who becomes the closest available person to regulate? Should it be the person that actually deployed it on the blockchain, the producer? But in some cases, perhaps you cannot identify who is the person who deployed the software. Should it actually be the users which are using that platform? And then we go back to the context of like peer-to-peer file sharing, in which the law is actually going after the users as opposed to the people providing the service. Or perhaps do we actually need to introduce like backdoors or kill switches? So if someone deploys a smart contract on the blockchain that operates on its own and that is actually doing torts to people, then should there be a requirement that the people deploying the technology, the people deploying the blockchain, provide a way for shutting down those entities, those algorithmic entities, which no one has power over, right? And in that case, then it goes back to like the whole discussion about like the war on crypto, right? So is there like is there any way that we can regulate those technology without actually preventing the actual autonomy of those new algorithmic devices?
Okay, now we're going to go for our coffee break.
That's correct. The coffee break will be, as you know, this is your time. We can reconvene at 11:45. There is another Starbucks behind us, in case you want to not use those two machines. So please convene at 11:45, or be ready to go at 11:45. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank our panelists.
And thank you
this has been just a real pleasure.